It was about 20 years ago, but I remember it as if it were yesterday. I wasn't even 10 years old then. My name is Men, even though it's hard to pronounce in America, so they still use the word male instead. I'm from Thailand, but during the school break my family sent me to live with my uncle in Texas to learn English. He had 2 sons, Danny and Tony, who were a little older than me, and we spent the summer in Texas together, trying to find fun things to do. One summer, I must have been about 9 years old, my cousins and I decided to go on an adventure. It was the early 2000s, and the trend for kids around our age, especially in America, was to head into the wilderness. Climbing mountains, camping in the woods, grilling some barbecue, it was all the rage. We were staying in Dallas, but the local woods there could get crowded during the long holidays. So, we opted to travel farther out, to a quieter, more rural town. The place we were heading was remote, about 7 or 8 hours away from Dallas, and barely anyone went there. The drive felt endless, but finally, we arrived at the edge of an expansive, almost empty forest. This is not the rainforests of Thailand where you can feel the greenness of the trees. No, this is the open forests of Texas. The trees are not tall or wide, and there is not enough shade to hang a hammock or climb up to sleep on the branches. It is the kind of forest where the land stretches as far as the eye can see, with sparse trees dotting the area. Uncle dropped us off near the edge of the forest, promising to pick us up the next day. No cell phones back then, so we had to trust our timing and rely on Grace, our leader for this little expedition. Grace was in her late teens, about 19 or so, already in college, and she was supposed to keep an eye on us kids. With Danny at 12, Tony at 13, and me at 9, we were eager but a bit clueless. Grace had the map and the gear, so we trusted her. We walked along the riverbank, chatting, singing, laughing, nothing unusual for a group of kids on an adventure. By noon, we had ventured deep into the woods, completely at ease. It wasn't until the cold started creeping in around 3 in the afternoon that we decided to set up camp. Grace warned us not to camp too close to the water. Animals came down to drink at night, and it wasn't smart to be in their path. We marked our spot with rocks and leaves, then moved about 200 meters deeper into the woods before setting up camp. As the sun set, we fired up the grill, had a barbecue, and settled in for the night. It was a clear, cool evening, the sky full of stars. In typical American fashion, we weren't afraid of ghost stories, so we shared a few, laughing off any creeping fear. But things took a strange turn when Grace pulled out something from her backpack. It was a wooden board, about the size of a small tray. On it were letters from A to Z, arranged in a grid. At the top left was the word yes, and at the top right, no. At the bottom of the board, the word goodbye was etched in large letters. A small triangular piece with a glass lens in the middle accompanied the board. Grace explained that it was a Ouija board, like something out of a horror movie. We'd heard of the game before, the V-board, or what people here in America called the Ouija board. Grace had brought it along, more as a joke than anything else. We were just kids, after all, and didn't really believe in ghosts. So when she suggested we try it that night after telling ghost stories, we shrugged it off and said, why not? There we were, gathered around in our tent, the board laid out in front of us. Our fingers lightly touched the planchette, ready to ask the usual silly questions. The first few rounds? Nothing. We giggled, feeling foolish, asking basic questions like, is anyone here, and what's your name? The board didn't budge. But then Grace, always the bold one, asked, who are you? Her tone was more demanding, almost rude. That's when the planchette began to shake. It wasn't immediate. At first, it quivered under our fingertips, then slowly, deliberately, it moved toward the letter W. Then I. We exchanged nervous glances, our fingers frozen on the board as it spelled out, TCH. Which? We stared at the word in shock until we heard a voice from out of nowhere. It was a strange, cold laugh, like an old woman whose voice was cracking from age. But in reality, it wasn't coming from the board, but from outside. We all pulled our hands away from the board in shock. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Everyone nodded, their eyes wide with surprise. The board had already moved to goodbye, but we didn't stay to ask any more questions. It was late, it was cold, and we were sleepy, but we weren't scared. It wasn't time yet. We thought it was just a strange coincidence. After all, none of us really believed in ghosts, did we? We joked about it as we fell asleep, thinking it was over. But the next morning, things got stranger. I was the first one to step outside the tent, and there they were, sticks, or maybe small branches, stuck into the ground around our campsite. 6 or 7 of them, planted like markers. I tried pulling one out of the ground, but it wouldn't budge. They hadn't been there the night before. I asked Danny, Tony, even Grace, they hadn't seen anything. That's when the chill in the air wasn't just from the morning cold. Something was wrong. We packed up quickly, skipping breakfast, and started hiking back. We thought we knew the way, following the riverbank as we had the day before. But no matter how far we walked, the familiar landmarks never showed up. By noon, we realized something was seriously wrong. We should have been back at the pond by then, the spot where Uncle had dropped us off. But the trees, the river, nothing looked right. Grace checked her compass. The direction was correct. Yet, we kept walking in circles. Around 3 p.m., panic started to set in. Were we lost? Danny and Tony started whispering about it, and I could feel my own fear creeping in. Grace tried to reassure us, saying we weren't lost, that it was just taking longer than expected. By 5 p.m., the sun was starting to set, and we still hadn't found our way out. Tired and low on supplies, we had no choice but to camp again. The plan was to stay one night, but now, we were facing a second night in the woods with barely enough food. Grace insisted we stay put, saying someone would notice we hadn't returned and would come looking for us. That night, the mood was different. We didn't tell stories or laugh. We sat around the fire in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest. But then, just as we were about to turn in for the night, we heard it again. That laugh. This time it was louder, closer. We jumped out of our sleeping bags and huddled together, staring into the darkness. Grace grabbed a flashlight and rushed outside, telling us to stay put. She was determined to figure out what was going on. We watched as she disappeared into the trees, her flashlight bobbing with her steps. 20 minutes passed. No sign of Grace. No sound. We called her name, but the forest swallowed our voices. We waited, hoping she'd come back, but eventually, fear got the better of us. None of us were over 15, and we sat there, terrified, crying and whispering to each other until we drifted into a restless sleep. When morning came, we woke to find something even more terrifying. The tent walls were damp with morning dew, but there was more. Imprinted on the tent's surface was a faint outline. A face. A body. And long, bony fingers pressing against the fabric. We thought we were well prepared. We had our older cousin Grace to lead the way, and we were in high spirits. But the forest had other plans. The second strange thing we found that morning after Grace disappeared was branches, creepy branches driven into the ground. They hadn't been there the night before, but this morning they were surrounding our tent. And this time, Danny dug them out. Hair. Long, golden strands, like something out of a nightmare. There were tufts of it, too many for us to explain. We tried to rationalize it, but deep down, we knew something was wrong. Grace was still missing, and no matter how much we called out, she never came back. The day passed in fear. We sat huddled together, not daring to leave our campsite, hoping that someone would find us. We hardly ate anything. I could only drink a little water from a nearby stream. But mostly just waiting. The evening came again, and it was suffocatingly quiet. Then the crying started. It was a man's voice this time, wailing in agony. We couldn't see him, but his cries filled the air, carried on the wind. It was the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold, like someone being tortured in the distance. Ouch, ouch, the voice moaned. We clung to each other, too terrified to move, and eventually, the exhaustion of fear lulled us into sleep. Morning came with a miracle, police officers waking us up. We had been reported missing, and they'd finally found us. But Grace was still gone. We explained everything, even showed them where we had marked the forest. But the strangest part? None of the markers we had left were there. It was as if the forest had swallowed all the marks we had made along with Grace. For days, the search parties combed the woods, but no trace of her was ever found. The forest, vast and silent, kept its secrets. Grace simply vanished. And to this day, no one has seen or heard from her again. In America, we mark graves to say goodbye. But Grace never got one. There was no body, no closure. Her parents tried everything, but after years of searching, they had to accept the hardest truth of all: some things are beyond explanation. We never went back to the forest, and I never will. But the lessons learned remain. Some mysteries, like Grace's disappearance, are a reminder of how small we are in the big picture, and how fragile our grip on reality is. The forest keeps secrets. 20 years have passed. And Grace, who never came back,